Hey folks, David Stewart here. Hope you guys are having a great day. It is Halloween as I am recording this, so it's time for a classic movie review. In this case, it's Nightmare on Elm Street, and of course, I'm going to plug some books. I write horror books. I don't just write fantasy and science fiction, I write horror. Eyes in the Walls. This is probably the most relevant to what I'll be talking about in terms of some of the techniques that make Nightmare on Elm Street a great horror movie. This is a fan favorite. You should definitely read it. You should definitely check it out. It has a pretty famous double ending, and maybe that means like a twist ending. You'll have to read and find out. Demon Ex Machina, this is more science fiction horror, and you can get this for free by joining my mailing list, dvspress.com/list. Another fan favorite I don't have a copy of sitting around here is Voices of the Void. You can also read Sorcerer's Blood, which I wrote live on the air, which is pretty cool, and Wasting Desert, another fantasy horror book that I wrote a while back. So check out those books. Lots of horror books for you to read. Nightmare on Elm Street is a great movie that I think everyone should watch if you are remotely interested in horror, you enjoy horror at all, or you're a student of the craft. That means you want to know better how to make good horror movies or how to write good horror books. It has a lot of classic techniques inside of it and things that also became tropes. It's a major cultural touchstone. It's parodied even to this day. You still have, like, Rick and Morty are still going to be doing parodies of Nightmare on Elm Street. It shows up again and again and again in popular references because it was one of those movies that it did well when it was released, but people continually watched it on VHS. It became one of those classic VHS rental movies from the 80s and 90s. It spawned a whole franchise. That franchise crossed over with other franchises, and what better place to start with it than the original? I think it's a great movie to watch if you are a student of the craft, though, for sure. And that's because it's a relatively modestly budgeted movie. I think it had about $1 million budget, which is sizable. That's not like a B movie budget for the time, but it does a lot with its budget. It doesn't need a lot of really big set pieces. It's mostly shot in small areas, homes, like hallways. There's not a lot of expensive set pieces that you need for horror like this, and you can spend your budget instead on really cool practical special effects. And there's definitely some good ones in this movie that I think people, again, who like movies are going to be really interested in seeing. Very clever use of practical special effects to create some really great horror movies in this movie. In terms of the writing and the overall organization of the movie, this is where I think it shines as a classic of horror. It does use some tropes that were already present before Nightmare on Elm Street came out. The old, I'm going to quote an episode of Weird Science, if you guys remember the TV show. There's a sex drives or machete magnets. That's one of the things that you see in this movie, and it's been present in other slasher films before Nightmare on Elm Street. But a big one is what I call the contrast, and I did a separate video on this, the contrast between the true believer and the unbeliever. That is, this is something that you see in horror a lot, and I've used it in Eyes in the Walls in particular, and that is that there's a threat, but no one believes it. And the people who know that it's a threat are not believed by the people who have the potential to help them mitigate that threat. So in a movie like Jaws, they believe in this big shark. The mayor or whoever doesn't want to believe them, and because doesn't want to scare people, wants people to enjoy the summer, to be able to go to the beach, to make money, all that kind of stuff. So you have a true believer and a non-believer, and of course the true believer is correct in this circumstance, but no one really wants to believe him. In Nightmare on Elm Street, the believers are the children. They're the ones who are really threatened by this nightmarish creature who turns out to be Fred Krueger. Who becomes Freddy Krueger, I guess, as time goes on. But in the original movie, he's just Fred Krueger. And the parents don't want to believe it, right? It's inconvenient for them to believe it. They don't believe it. So you have sort of the adults and the isolated children. And the isolation of childhood and children, I think, is a really powerful trope that exists in a lot of 20th century horror, really, especially for my generation. That is, anyone born, say, late 60s to the 90s, I think once you get into being born in the 90s, you start to lose this, which is this feeling that adults were away from you. Like, adults were not really fully present. They didn't really care about your needs or wants. You were very independent and on your own. The latchkey generation, you were on your own. You went home from school, your parents were working, and you maybe didn't see them until dinner or like close to bedtime. You were on your own quite a bit. And that creates a very isolated feeling. It's something that shows up in a lot of Stephen King books where somebody's maybe tortured by a bully and there's no one there to help them. Like the adults are not capable, or which hurts more, they're unwilling to help their children. And that's the case in Nightmare on Elm Street. By the way, if any of this are spoilers, you could turn this off and just take my recommendation that you need to watch this movie if you haven't ever watched it or you're remotely interested in horror. I still think it holds up pretty well to this day. But there's going to be spoilers because it's 40 years old. That should be expected. So the children who are threatened by Freddy Krueger, their adults don't believe them. We have a good little mini mystery plot, let's say, where we are, or the children are uncovering the truth about Fred Krueger, who the parents knew he was, why they refused to tell the children about him, what he's doing in their nightmares, and in true form to any sort of conflict, the children who are isolated and alone and the parents don't believe them, they are further endangered by their parents not believing them. And they also have to come up with a plan to finally rid themselves of the threat. So the first plan to avoid the threat is to not go to sleep, because Freddy Krueger attacks you and kills you when you go to sleep. So the main characters, they start to figure out, if we go to sleep, we'll be killed. If we let our friends go to sleep, they'll be killed. After several of them are murdered, that's the conclusion that they come up with is that this is not going to work. They can't stay awake forever. They can't be constantly cycling their sleep. The parents aren't going to allow them. And so in the third act, you have this heightened feeling of isolation and this contrast, this conflict between those who believe and those who don't believe, when you have the main character, who's the character name slips me, but her boyfriend's Johnny Depp. And so the parents lock her mom locks her in the house. Literally, she can't escape the house. There's burglar bars on the windows because she just doesn't like her daughter getting out. She's upset with her daughter, making up all of this Fred Krueger nonsense and believing this nonsense. And of course, she's been drinking herself into a stupor to try to deal with the bad memories of this child murderer, Fred Krueger. And then meanwhile, her boyfriend's parents across the street, they don't want to pick up the phone. They don't want to let her wake him up to protect him. And of course, he ends up being murdered. There's a great special effects scene when that happens too, where they constructed the whole room upside down and then turned the camera upside down so it looked like blood was shooting up all over the ceiling and pouring all over the ceiling. Oh, it's just an upside down room, but it looks really cool. Great example of really clever special effects that Wes Craven used to make this movie. And there's so many good examples if you're a filmmaker for clever practical effects in a sort of limited set and limited environment that really make the movie feel scary, especially for the time. So that big conflict really comes to a head. Like, okay, well, we have to go into the dream and I have to pull Freddy out of the dream. We have a little bit of a thread before that where she's able to pull his hat out of the dream. So she reasons, I could pull him out of the dream and then we can kill him. And so there's a big action sequence that happens at the end. Now, when you get to the end of the movie, you'll actually get to the thing that I think is worst about the movie, which is the ending. I think even in a horror movie, you need a good falling action. You need a good denouement. You need a resolution to the conflict. And we almost get that. So what happens is we're really getting that. Like, we're fighting Freddy Krueger. The main character, she decides that Freddy is not real, that she's been dreaming the whole time. So that's a big reveal that we have. And so she just denies that he's real and he disappears. This doesn't quite feel as, it's an interesting twist, but it doesn't feel like it's really, like we really can buy into it. There hasn't been enough of a thread beforehand that we haven't been seeing things that are real. There hasn't been any little hints that she might have been dreaming along the way. If that had been done just a little bit better, I would have bought that more. And then, of course, But that's not the really bad ending. The really bad ending happens after they wake up, they get in the car, and of course she's still dreaming. So, the big twist is she was dreaming the whole time, and then the twist ending before the credits roll is she's still dreaming. And that's just not, I just feel like that's a weak ending. It wasn't Wes Craven's original ending, is my understanding. At least that was like the lore, is that he didn't want that twist ending, but the studio wanted it. So they're like, what the hell? And so the one that they came up with was the one that amused them the most, which was like Freddy Krueger pops out and kills the mom. He like sucks her in through a window, and it looks really funny. And I actually, this last time I watched it, I did laugh at that particular moment, but it does, to me, doesn't unwind the movie in a great way. And because we're not left with any kind of denouement, I think it reduces the lingering feeling of scariness that a lot of movies have. I think horror movies where we're able to get like a proper resolution, even if there's a threat of like, he could come back, or, he's chained at the bottom of Lake Placid, or whatever it is, for like Friday the 13th, one of the Friday the 13th movies. Even something like that would give you more of a feeling of like, we've solved the problem for now, than, oh, they're still dreaming and still having to deal with Freddy Krueger. So I'm not a huge fan of the ending, but I think it works. And, overall, I think all of the techniques that you have there are really, really effective. I think you needed the main characters to be teenagers or be children, so that they are isolated and alone because their parents don't believe them. They're at the mercy of their parents. Children are powerless, and it's frightening to be a child because you don't know all the things in the world, and you don't have a way to control the effects of the world. You're at the mercy of the world, so to speak. So making the characters children, even if you're watching as an adult, you can remember being a child. And so that childhood trauma, that childhood fear can really take hold and make a really effective emotional high, which is what I think you get with this movie. So other things that I would say before I close this off is another great point, another great reason that horror should be looked at for a lot of filmmakers that are looking to do things on a budget is this was one of the earlier examples of a totally electronic score. It's all synthesizers. There's no real instruments in the score as far as I know. It's not the first, right? There was ones that came before this. Tron, of course, had the Walter Carlos soundtrack, which is just amazing, and worked great for that. And you had something like Blade Runner that had, the Vangelis score is something more like electroacoustic, like there's acoustic instruments. In this case, it's all electronic, which means it can be done very cheaply compared to hiring an orchestra, having a composer that has to write out all of the cues and then record them properly and then have them edited into the movie. You can record a synth soundtrack, and it's just relatively simple and easy and cheap. So it's a great option. And the thing is, a filmmaker now could have a single composer make a synth score that doesn't even sound like a synth score, that sounds like an orchestral score, or just has much better sounds. So this is one of those things about the movie that I think at times it really holds up, and at other times it really doesn't hold up, because it's so full of these classic synthesizer sounds from the 1980s, some of these FM like Yamaha DX7 kinds of sounds that you'll hear throughout the 80s. It feels so nested into the time period that it's made in. You might find it cheesy. You might find those sound effects cheesy. I know I certainly do. That doesn't mean that they're completely ineffective. It just means there are many places where the soundtrack just doesn't really hold up like you would want it to over time. And it doesn't hold up as well as other electronic soundtracks from relatively the same period, like some of the other ones that I mentioned. It's still good, and I think it's worth for people of the craft to note how that soundtrack worked. I think it's well composed. I mainly just think that the synth sounds are just, they're a product of their time, and they could be better done now, right? If you had access to the same, if that composer, his name slips my mind, I'm really sorry, but if you had access to the same technology you have today, I think you'd produce a better sounding score, even with that same material. It's just kind of where the limitations were at the time, but it probably saved him a lot of money and trouble to have that synth score, and it gives it a very strong character. It sounds a certain way that is really going to be familiar and special, especially if you're watching now. You don't hear a lot of these sounds these days. So that's the last bit I'll say on that. Nightmare on Elm Street, you should watch it. It's a classic movie. It's one that is a real touchstone for the horror genre and movies in general for very good reason. And it's one that gets endlessly referenced in popular culture because of what it did that was special. This idea of like a dream within a dream, the idea of the dream sort of affecting you in the real world. We find these little breadcrumbs or whatever. We find the echoes of these ideas in all sorts of other movies. Movies that you wouldn't think, like The Matrix, has ideas from like Nightmare on Elm Street in it a little bit, right? So for that reason, I think it's worth watching, even if you're not super into horror or you feel like it doesn't really hold up or it's not as scary as it was. I still think there's great scares in it. I think maybe by modern standards, it might be considered a rather tame movie, which is saying something because it's very violent and it's very bloody. But I think a lot of horror makers have gone to this extreme of trying to be gory rather than being frightening. And Nightmare on Elm Street really works on the tension of the moment, that the terror is not in the bang, but in the anticipation of it. Wes Craven's like, no, we're also going to make the bang really scary. We're going to have a really strong fear of anticipation of the bang. And then when we do something serious, it's going to be like a bloody, gory mess. It's going to really shock you. That way, you're going to be extra afraid when the next one is going to happen in the movie. So I think those super violent murder scenes are actually really effective in the context of this because they're rare, they're not constant, and you have a lot of tension building up to those moments. So anyway, let me know what you think down below. I'd love to read your comments. Eyes in the Walls. You can check it out on Amazon right now, as well as the other horror books that I mentioned. Sorcerous Blood, Demon Ex Machina, which you can get on my mailing list, deviouspress.com/list, and The Wasting Desert, fantasy horror. With some of my characters from The Eternal Dream. So check it out, and I'll see you all next time. Have a great, great day, and happy Halloween.